Here we go. We'll add a few more people. So yeah, welcome to 20 second talk. This is flying by, and apologies. This is a delayed talk from last week. I was feeling a little bit under weather and wasn't too up for the podcast, so I had to push it. But yeah, this one should be an interesting one. It's super open ended. Honestly, I think Guillaume and I will probably talk for a little bit to get the ball rolling. But this is one where we want to invite you guys to just come up, give us your opinion on your thoughts on how will Archi-Techs play a role in a sustainable future. As usual, there's myself and Guillaume. I think we might be joined by Faisal later on, but we'll see. But yeah, this is going to be a super open-ended one. I can maybe get the ball rolling a little bit in terms of what I mean by this. And then Guillaume and I we'll probably have a little bit of back and forth. But yeah, I think it's a kind of interesting topic I've been meaning to do for a little bit. Um, because I think, as architects, we have this short time to kind of play our role towards a more sustainable future. When you think about it, in, let's say, my career, or most people in the audience, right, most of their careers are probably going to span another 30 years, right? Which brings us to around 2050, which is the kind of, uh, you know, benchmark, not milestone mark for kind of reversing or being able to change the way that our world is kind of evolving in terms of like carbon emissions and greenhouse gases and all that kind of thing. So I think we have a really short time, and in the architecture world, 30 years is like a very short time. So we have a really short period or short window as architects to create or to play our role towards a sustainable future. And especially when you look at like the construction industry is a major contributor to CO2 emissions. Like I read a lot of statistics around the 38-40% of yearly CO2 emissions come from the construction industry. Obviously that doesn't, that includes uh, construction, use of the building, and all that kind of stuff. But when you also look at the construction industry is one of the few industries that's actually declining in efficiency. So we're actually building slower now than we were like 10 or so years ago, which is kind of pretty crazy in itself. I feel like, the construction industry is ripe for innovation. And we kind of face this future where we have to build more. We have like this affordable housing crisis, rising population, and so on and so forth. All these statistics we're kind of familiar with, right? And so we face this future where we have to build more, we need to build faster, but at the same time, more sustainably. And I think architects can play a huge role in that. And of course, what I mean by an architect, right, is an architect that is kind of digitally fluent or speaks the language of code, although I guess you don't necessarily have to actually code, but the combination of BIM computation, digital fabrication, all these kind of things. And technology is not necessarily the single thing. It's not like a silver bullet, but I do think that it's a huge piece of the puzzle. But it's also kind of part of the solution, but also part of the problem. Like on one hand, I also see technologies has given us the ability to and various other technologies to help streamline the design process. We can create more informed design and create use modern methods of construction, which is all good. That plays kind of part of this role towards creating a sustainable future. But on the other hand, we're also seeing this kind of trend very much in the architecture world where these tools have allowed us to create more complex and extravagant forms, or like I want to, it's a bit of a weird term, but like an Instagrammy era of architecture. And whilst people from the outside are always asking me about affordable housing, sustainable design, prefabrication, like you architects must be so interested in it, and obviously there's a lot of architects there, but there is also a reality that there is a lot of architects that are just interested in using this technology to create more and more crazy looking architecture, more extravagant architecture. And I think Faisal made a great point in our parametric talk regarding, we've kind of been in this era of creating crazy complicated architecture with parametric tools and technologies. But now we have this kind of new era where, the experimentation is kind of over and now we should start using it to create more sustainable architecture. And, this conversation could go in so many different ways, from how technology can help us streamline design process via automation. How can we as architects extend the design process into active making via digital fabrication, 3D printing, CNC, and all that kind of stuff. How we can use, computational tools to create carbon estimation calculators, energy analysis, all this kind of stuff. So it's a super open discussion. So be sure to raise your hands and come up here and share your view. But yeah, maybe I'll just bounce it off Guillaume and get your thoughts on where you see architects playing a role in a sustainable future.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll take it from the point of view, or I take it from the point of what I've been exposed to, and I think as a structural engineer and then as a computational designer, but doing a lot of analysis. I mean, to me, the biggest thing that technology can give us right now is more predictability, kind of like really understand what we're doing when we're designing and have a kind of a feedback loop. So um, there's a lot of tool that allows us to, try to understand how daylight works so that you could, minimize the amount of artificial light you would need during the day, or how, because of the exposure of your building, for example, how you can optimize self-shading so that you reduce your solar gain through your windows, for example. So, I mean, all these tools are great. I think there is still a lot of work to do for a lot of offices to integrate that in their design process, and it's hard because it still takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy to, you know, create a model that's easy to study and that's ready for a study. You also need just straight knowledge to understand what parameters you put in, not to kind of like do this quick, colorful kind of marketing diagram to be like, okay, it's green, it's good. Like you really need to understand, what the levels you need to get are, and how to achieve them, and then um, all the results that you get, give them some sense and actually use them for a purpose. Um, and a lot of time, I think what happens in offices is that once your building is designed, you do the analysis to make sure you're not too far off, but you didn't use the tool to kind of make it better. Um, which I think, at least in structural engineering, I've been exposed to this kind of processes much more, um, in terms of like creating a structure that's the most efficient and the lowest like materials usage as possible. Um, like typically when you design a structure, you'd start with just code standards in terms of loads. And then, in the past, you would do a few hand calculations to estimate your stress, and then design all your beams and columns, for example. And then that's the dimension, and that what you give to the contractor to build. But since now we have finite element modeling, you can really look at every single beam for every single load that you design and really almost optimize beam per beam what they need to be, versus in the past you would probably look at one that you think is the worst case scenario and then kind of extrapolate and apply that everywhere. So you kind of, we used to over design quite a bit, and now we are able to really adjust at a much finer grain, and reduce tonnage. And then the other thing you can do is, instead of using kind of the blanket code loads that you have, which are again quite conservative because they are made to kind of cover as many cases as possible and cover bad areas. Now, for example, for wind, you can do a full analysis with really modeling wind. That used to be done a lot more, and still done in wind tunnels, to get like pressure locally on all the points of your building. but more and more, and it's much more cost effective, is to do fluid dynamic analysis on a computer, and then starting to have really precise loads that you can apply to your building and really get the worst case scenario, but real worst case scenario, not like blanket worst case scenario from the code. So you're able to save like pretty significant amount of steel. For example, for a steel building, I think we're looking at 20-30% reduction of tonnage, which has a huge impact, like from the production of all the building elements all the way to recycling at the end. If your building is lighter and built with minimum material, then everybody benefits from that. Um, so yeah, I guess that would be my
Yeah, you're almost going down like the more informed and optimized kind of design process, really.
right.
Like using
Right.
these tools from an early stage to answer those big questions. Because whenever the more moves you make earlier on, the bigger effects you can create later on, if that makes sense. Like your example of like instead of designing, then afterwards you like analyze it and you're like, oh, okay, this building kind of works. You could use that information to actually drive the shape of the building from the beginning, kind of thing.
Yeah, and there are a few offices that would do that, and kind of like, I mean, we have all seen like um, kind of like like generative massing design where you're
Right.
like trying to minimize shadows to the neighbors, for example. Um, and it looks to me still more like a marketing thing, telling the client, hey, we can do all this kind of stuff. We are top notch. But for 99.9% of the project, you probably just run with your gut feeling at the beginning, and then it's too late to really go and thoroughly go through every single possible option you have for one building, and um, you kind of pass that time and then you just go with
Yeah.
what you have, which is the reality of most projects.
I think for sure that's a what I would say is like a low hanging fruit for architects to we're essentially informed design and also streamlining the design process. But just thinking of the question of like what is the I don't know, not a single technology, but like what is the one thing that I think architects could do to really move the needle in the construction industry. And it's almost like we need to very quickly rebuild the entire design to build process. And the most effective way of doing that would be to kind of focus, or like for architects to kind of come back out of this bubble of just designing and start making again, right? And using, a combination of all these things, computational design and uh, informed design and all these kind of things, but then extend it to the act of making through digital fabrication. Because you still think about it, like I go back to that diagram of shop architects, where like we they kind of, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's a diagram of like how the relationships or power struggle or whatever in the AEC world is, and you have like the contractor is like an elephant, and then the developer is like a rhino, and like all these uh, all these characters, like even the consultants are like quite medium-sized animals, and the architect is this depicted as a little butterfly that's like floating above them, like, hey, you need to do this and that. But because we don't have any skin in the game, and we're also not involved in the act of making, I wonder a question like, can we make enough impacts to truly move the needle towards a more sustainable future?
Yeah, and I think trying to there is a lot about education. I think like now that I'm exposed in like other companies, smaller companies, it seems like the concept slash schematic design phases are, it's just a sketch on a piece of paper sometime, and then you go straight into detailing everything. I think there is a lot that can be done if you tell your client, listen, if we probably need to spend 2 months, say, on this building to do concept design so that we have real time to explore all the potential we have here instead of just jumping to the kind of traditional way of doing, which is why I think a lot of projects skip all this kind of early phase or like really reduce them to the minimum, be like, we've done that for 30 years, we'll do it slightly different just to fit the site, but not take advantage of this project to suddenly question the way things are done and kind of like restart from scratch and really have a kind of a thorough um, evaluation of all the things we can do to make it better.
Yeah, that's interesting that now you're getting this new perspective because now you're working for a design build firm, right? So you are more towards that design and well, obviously designing a building.
Yeah, and a lot of discussions are from the very beginning geared towards like, okay, are we gonna be able to build that efficiently and cost effectively? Um, and I've not been working on project from scratch, so I'm looking forward to see how projects start. But from what I see, it seems like when I compare it to big, it's like you could almost start a project and go straight into DD or CD,
Mm,
versus big where you spent a lot, like most of the time and energy, and the client are told like this is where we want to spend the money is in the concept. Um,
yeah.
so it's a different model, and I don't know which one's best. Like you do, it's really important to try to understand really early what how you're gonna build things.
It
But
must
there is
you
the
need that sweet middle, right?
yeah, you don't want to jump into, okay, let's think about building it before you even thought of, just at a massing level, what could we do to make it more efficient, for example.
Yeah. Um, do raise your hands and come up and like add your own perspective on this. Like, is there something that you guys think a technology on the horizon, or something that you think architects would adopt or use as a means to kind of really affect our future in a positive way? Um, but no, yeah, I think there's something to be said about, like you said, education and putting ideas out there. I mean, this was kind of where both Architect Network and also um, Pixel, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, Pixel's my own little think tank, I guess you could call it, where I just kind of work on competitions and put it out there. You can check it through the link on my Instagram page. But yeah, it's just kind of putting out ideas that I think kind of tunes into this, like architecture ideas that positively shapes the future. And I think there's some really interesting technologies. I mean, we did a talk on mass timber. I've been super interested in mass timber since about 2016, 2017. I started to play with projects using it, and that's one thing that that could actually really move the needle, but you don't think of it as a technology, but it's kind of a reinvention of an old technology. We obviously did a talk on that. What was that, Guillaume? That was like our fourth or fifth talk.
Pretty early on with Florian.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's things like that are super interesting, like the combination of mass timber, prefabrication, generative design. Like you can really see how you could completely reinvent the design process, and especially if you even focus on a typology, let's say housing or office, and like you created a process where you could very quickly generate the design documents and all that kind of stuff using these modular components in a sustainable way or with a sustainable material. But it's configurable enough where you can kind of uh, adapt to the local context, the materiality, the environment, and that kind of stuff. You could see how you could actually completely reinvent the design to build process.
Yeah, and I'd like to get back to like one thing you mentioned about complex geometries too. um, like yes, there are a lot of times where complex geometry is not efficient or makes things harder, and down the line just make the building, I guess, consuming more than it needs to. But there are times where, and if you look at the work at Fryoto, for example, it's really the form is there to make it as efficient as possible and minimize um, all the elements in the building as much as possible. Like, how do you get the largest cover, for example, in the stadium in Munich? How do you get the largest coverage of protection using a minimal surface and um, you know having only tension compression members, which basically gets rid of the bending, for example, and reduces all the elements to like the bare minimum. Of course, there is a lot that you don't see, that suddenly the foundation become huge because you have all this stress that happens, but it is a complex shape, and there are many examples of complex shape that actually achieve more than your straight box in a way. And I think technology allows us to build more complex because you suddenly have control of all the geometry, and each element can be cut in a certain shape, and all the connections are understood, and they could be, you know, um, be made one by one and all different, without a huge impact on the cost.
Yeah.
Um, but you get the efficiency of the structure overall.
I think that's it.
Again,
If it's driven by like a purpose or a function as well,
yeah,
then yeah, I think it's super interesting. I mean, it's really interesting when you see engineers kind of combining generative design and then like it's a concrete slab or something, and what it basically takes away the material that's not needed, and you get this incredible like 3D printed or whatever, however they make it, like a concrete slab that's like super efficient but uses the least amount of material. I think that's like super interesting, but you don't see it being taught that much. Do you know what I mean? Like when you see a lot of these online tutorials and things like that, it's not so much that stuff. It's more like, here's how to make a crazy shape, and you can make like this wicked looking Instagrammable thing, building object.
yeah,
And
totally,
we're skipping that part and just like, oh, let's just create something crazy looking.
yeah,
But yeah, I think there's definitely a bit more education, and hopefully we'll be releasing some stuff soon on how to use computational tools to do these kind of things as well, which I think there's obviously place, there's some existing, but it's just not the most common thing. And I think, you know, going back to why we started Architect Network, um, just understanding technology and what's available and what you can and can't do, or you might be able to do in the very near future, is a big part of that. Just educating us as architects and each other um, around technology, and how technology can be used to streamline the workflows, automate, create more informed design, all those kind of things.
yeah. And I think, I mean, I'm highly biased here, but I don't know if you would disagree that I think there is a lot to do on education on technology, but also on science. Like, just if you understand more how, I mean, for my case, how structure works, then you can have conversation and try to optimize. If you understand more how, the flow of energy, or like the whole MEP system works, for example, then you can push things. And if you understand your building better at the general level, um, then you have the tools to also um, change things. If you always depend also on other people to look at it and tell you what to do, it makes it harder because you kind of create bottlenecks sometime, or you don't involve the right person early on to have a look and give their expertise, which happens a lot. Like, I don't know, you typically involve structure engineers or MEP engineers. Say, once your building looks like something, they don't want to be involved until you have a plan to show them, and then they're like, okay, that looks like we could make it work this way. Um,
Yeah,
so it's either involving them early or educating yourself so that you can have an idea on how things work early on, and how that can influence your design as well.
yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, no. If anyone's got any questions, do raise your hands. Don't leave us hanging here. Come and join into the conversation. Show us your perspective on things. We'd be kind of interested to see everyone's thoughts or anything that's kind of interesting them. Here we go. We have one person coming up. Um, but yeah, I think that's interesting. I really enjoyed starting. When I started to work at Front, I was working with engineers a lot more, and that's where I was kind of really uh, opened my eyes to like having engineers in the conversation super early on. And the great thing about engineers is they can answer real world questions, which I think we as architects don't always, I guess. Um, but and there's also, I've just been just a shout out to format engineers in the UK. I just did a fun little kind of experiment with them, and they're a really interesting engineer that are very computationally driven, and they often get involved in with other architects at a very early stage, and working with them is super interesting, just from even from a conversational perspective of how they kind of view things. So yeah, be sure to look up Format Engineers. They're a super interesting company. Peter, what's going on? I see you come up to yours.
Hey guys, yeah, I was interested when you guys were talking about what's the role of the architect, especially as these new kind of computational technologies come up. And it made me think, like, when we were discussing Guillaume working at a design build place now compared to kind of like a pure architecture studio. Um, I think in terms of sustainability, for me, it's I really think design build has more of an opportunity, and I'd even expand beyond that. Kind of what you guys were saying. I think the future of a sustainable building practice is really like beyond design build. It's like informed design build, and I think as these new technologies arise. Um, they have so much kind of complexity and specialty that you need the people who work on the actual technology to be part of the team. So prototyping, developing the technology, and of course on projects, when you want to create something custom in steel, you work with like Zaner and you come up with some custom thing, and they'll help you work through it. But um, I think it's not just design build in my understanding is just like contractor and architect, but something that's more of like a, I don't know, I'm just calling like informed design build. It's you have a structural engineer that's on early, you have a material scientist that's on early, you have a um, kind of like sustainable consultant basically that's in house that's on early, who's before you even start designing shapes. There's people informing like, oh, here are the local like material science information that you could use. Here's some like local climate and orientation data and all this sort of stuff. So I feel like those types of firms that have more stuff in house and basically are uh, cooking up this pot early with a lot of different specialties, with the architect kind of being a facilitator and an orchestrator of all these things, seems like it has a stronger future rather than um, yeah, kind of what Guillaume was alluding to, which is like really it's architects designing things, and then the other the other kind of components like people like contractor or structural engineer coming and just trying to figure out how to create that object. So I see a lot of potential in more of like a collective, like moving away from this design service model towards something that's kind of put together from the beginning.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And I think it also has kind of a psychological role to involve people earlier, um, because they're part of the decision process of how how do we decide to do things the way they are, instead of being like, hey, here's my design, figure it out kind of attitude. And there's this constant war of like contractors being pissed at architects for doing things that to their mind doesn't make any sense because it's not been thought through the eye of someone who's going to build it. And things are disconnected. And same with engineers. Um, so if you can have these discussions early, then it might really inform your design quite a bit. And I think there is hope. Like a lot of companies are starting to get a bit horizontal and try to integrate more specialists, or even educate themselves, to get as much as possible from the beginning.
Yeah, I could totally see. I know you kind of touched on what the future of practice looks like, but I could totally see the next generation of architecture practice looking a lot smaller, a smaller firms made up of, architect people, like, that have specialty skill sets in addition to being an architect or an engineer or whatever. Um, and much smaller firms that are still able to do almost as much work as a traditional bigger firm at the moment, uh, through more streamlined design process and informed design, etc., etc. But then it also kind of raises the question: is then do you have an interdisciplinary team in-house, or do you partner up with a format, with a front, with a Kippers Helbig, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, and create these kind of team of Avengers, or do you have it all kind of in-house? You have like one engineer, an architect, and all these different people. Um, but I mean,
Yeah, I think all of them are viable, and I think they will
yeah,
happen. Um, I think just having them in house is just makes more of a. It kind of aligns um, the priorities and kind of the vision of everyone.
yeah. I think I'm kind of torn because yeah, in-house is great, but then I think you do lose a bit of, like, having worked at a place like Front, for example. There's so much knowledge inside that gets created because you just specialize and focus on this one thing. When you go down the in-house route, yes, you can hire someone who's a specialist, but I don't know if that kind of continued knowledge of working on loads of different things kind of suffers a little bit. But it also kind of, I guess, we're kind of touching on also this era of like the tech companies coming into our space because they also see this world of the AEC industry, is super inefficient but super promising. When you pitch the idea to someone, it's kind of a no-brainer. Hey, there's this industry, we need to build thousands of homes. We're not achieving it at all. It's like a huge industry. It's real estate, and we're these tech companies have been like, hey, no one's working on this. So then we've seen I guess you could say the WeWorks, the Googles, Katera, and all this kind of come into this and try to absorb or um, acquire like architecture firms, engineers, manufacturers, supply chains, and all that kind of stuff under one roof. But in Katera's example, it hasn't worked out too well, and WeWork, although they weren't kind of like a construction firm, so to speak, but they also went down that same route, and I think it didn't work out too well. Um, so yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to see, you know, where we as architects will fit into that. So, like these tech giants are coming into our space and creating this kind of huge in-house teams. Um, but we haven't seen many architects like make a move into that space, so to speak.
Yeah, and like for structure, for example, like having one person, say in an architecture office of 50, maybe they can afford to have one structure engineer look at different projects. But working at the engineering company with like 50 engineers, then even as an engineer, you'd be like, oh, well, I'm not too familiar, say, with wood construction, but you'll find two or three people that have done many projects in wood, and then, you know, the flow information is super helpful, and they can talk with the experience instead of kind of learning from the ground. So I think there's maybe a mixed model where you have kind of, I mean, you can dig really deep into specialization, um, but having like bridges, maybe a person who is kind of nimble between disciplines and kind of, or, you know, making the information flow from the very specialist to the more generalist architect. Because of course you cannot learn anything or everything for yourself. You need other people no matter what. But what I've seen is that there is a lot of time where it's just the communication between these people that are the problem. So having like bridges, people that are architects and have a little bit of experience in a more technical word, or vice versa. Can, like in an engineering company, people that understand better what architects are coming from and what they're trying to achieve, um, or like great assets in companies in general.
Yeah, when you talk about specialization, like, for example, if I think of the technology of like 3D printing, um, I'd almost think it was a better kind of like technological organization to, if the 3D printing company actually just hired a team of architects in house, um, that work together, because it's such a specialized technology that there are certain things about that technology and material that it just is so much more advantageous to have someone who's really specialized in it. But then Ollie brought up CLT, or like mass timber buildings, and I don't know if I would say that the company making the mass timber should hire an in-house architecture team. And I don't know where the relationship between architecture and technology is in every case. Like it might be separate. So yeah, like, is it better in some technologies if you have specialists, and in other technologies if you have generalists? Um, that was an interesting way to think about how architects and technology should go together in the future.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, an interesting example is obviously we're working with Icon 3D printing. Our project just went public this week, where we're 3D printing an experimental habitat for Mars. And yeah, so on one hand, I kind of agree, but I also disagree, because I've literally seen this in the, like, I think working. I think the results tend to work better where you create teams of specialists rather than have it all in house, unless you're able to attract the best of the best into your company.
Yeah, I think we have that thought
Yeah,
because, yeah, usually it's the in-house people. They're not hiring like, amazing designers or amazing architects. It's really just somebody to like stamp the drawings and these types of things. And so, which is why I don't think it's really been done in the way that maybe I'm imagining, which it's actually like architectural specialists with technology specialists, kind of working together on these types of things. Because take for example Big's relationship with Icon. I mean, if it continues to grow, it would be amazing because the specialty will build in house at Big, and that relationship and communication will improve with Icon. But a lot of times it's just architects, once or twice a decade working with a certain contractor or
right.
technology or manufacturer or something. So you don't ever really build those relationships. So if you can, and there are instances like I think Big just acquired a Danish contracting
Yep.
firm. Uh, there are instances where like this is happening, and this is why the design build, and it's very similar what we're talking about, like design build, and also just like creating Avenger teams. Um, the only difference that I really think is like trying to really align everyone under the same roof. It just kind of, yeah, like I don't know. I guess the Avengers all wore different outfits, but
Right.
all
They all
had the
have
same
their own
stamp or something.
movies, but they come together for like
Yeah,
so maybe that's the same thing.
right.
Like, yeah, I think that the relationship that we have with some of these companies is kind of maybe an indication, like owning a percentage of the company or something like that creates that long term partnership. Because it is crazy. You think of like how we design and build a building. We come up with an idea, and as architects, we can never do the same idea twice, so we throw everything away before we even start. then the people that we worked with on the last project, we don't necessarily work with again because of the location of the project, relationship with the client. So we create this whole new team, and then create this new prototype building. So yeah, even the simple idea of like having more long-term partnerships makes a lot of sense. But it seems like the overriding theme really is like us as architects moving closer to the act of making. I think if we were to discuss like an approach where we can really move the needle in the next 30 years towards a sustainable future, I think we have to take our head out of the bubble of design and start building things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think it's pessimistic, but I really think it's there is a world where I can see that it's actually technology companies who, depending on their technology, they find their markets that work best for them. And so, maybe a technology that's working on rammed earth is going to be market themselves in places where they know
Yeah.
they can use the local soil, and places that do 3D printing are going to market themselves in places where, um, you know, the climate is optimized for where they can 3D print, or all these sorts of things. And I think one opportunity is for architects to find um, what their role could be at a technology company, and hopefully do it differently than kind of what you were talking about, where these places hire in-house architects and they just kind of create uh, subpar designs.
So do you think architects are the people that will play a role in the sustainable future? Are we going to see, is this the beginning of the end of architecture practice as we know it? And because you could totally see the world of the Googles, the Amazons coming into our space and being like, hey, if you guys ain't solving it, get out of the way. We've got,
I mean, it's a very, I think they will,
yeah,
and it's a very interesting thing when you look at startups. People have tried to define what the metrics of a startup being successful
right.
is, and there was a bunch of metrics, and one is the idea, one is the leadership, one is the timing, and all these sorts of things. And the idea actually ranks fairly low. Um, so I'm not saying it is, but let's just say, for example, 3D printing is like the best idea for sustainability. Like, you can use earth-based materials and this and that. So let's say it's actually the most sustainable. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the one that's going to win, right? And so I think architects can find their role in that position where it's like, you identify an idea as an architect that you think has a lot of potential in this space, and I think architects can you know not create a specialty, but find a place and a way to have that technology or idea find its way into like um, success in a way. And I don't know what that means. I know there's a lot of factors there. It's like marketing, it's getting venture capital and all this sort of things. And so the architect's role is not to like solve everything, but just finding that way that architecture can kind of promote a technology and improve a technology,
Maybe
um, rather than
architects
yeah.
not rising up, that sounds like a revolt, but stepping up to become more entrepreneurial. And maybe we'll see, instead of creating architecture practices, architecture startups. Because we are, the Googles and the big tech crew coming into the AEC space is nothing new, right? We have Google creating partnering with Sidewalk Labs and creating their Google waterfront development in Toronto or whatever. We had Katera, we've had WeWork kind of, flirting with the idea of this, or you can argue they're a real estate company. Amazon, I think, is flirting with this kind of stuff. But we've also seen that the the Sidewalk Labs Toronto Google thing that completely imploded. We've got Katera, which went bust a few months ago. WeWork, that obviously, they overextended themselves a little bit. So there's a lot of these, like, the tech world have been getting into the AEC space, and I think they, from the outside, I see it like they're applying that Valley mentality of like technology that can, it's just, uh, break things quickly and get the product out there and we can update it. And like, it's a very fast moving industry, and it's something, you can release an app and that things are not working and you can update it later on. But when you're making things, that mentality is almost reversed in a way, and you can't just like put a building up and be like, yeah, we'll fix that in a few months, or like halfway through the process, like, oh, we will fix that in a few months when it's half built. I think that mentality doesn't
I mean,
work so well. I don't know if that's the reason why some of these like big tech things are failing. I'm just like, from a, you know,
I would actually say that architecture is not too far from that. I mean, we see like 432 Park. It's like, oh, we're going in and redoing the whole certain systems because they're not working or things are swaying. I mean, so we are often kind of retrofitting buildings, but yeah, for sure at a
Yeah.
different time scale and kind of
I mean, that I can
more
emphasize
intensive.
is like, that, could you call that a little bit, that's unforeseen in a way when you're creating a super tower like that? Of course, there's going to be stuff that you just have not, considered or like, didn't equate for that level of wind or whatever, or whatever it is. I can get that. But yeah, I just wonder from like maybe architects are a really good architects who have that slightly more entrepreneurial mindset. I guess are actually great. Maybe should start stepping up and doing it. But they got to have that Steve and Wozniak brain, right? You can't be that pure designer because you'll never get the business off the ground because you'll keep tweaking tweaking the design ever so slightly every day, and you'll never quite get there. Um, so yeah, I think it's a really interesting kind of question of like maybe it's not architecture practice that's really going to drive it. It's individual architects setting up businesses and startups, because that does seem like the most effective way to create change right now in society. Like the go,
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if it's the architect becoming entrepreneurial. I mean, I think that's one opportunity as well, but it's maybe even just some entity realizing the value of architecture. And as a very uneducated tech person, the example I like to go to is something like Tesla, um, where yeah, sure they look however they look. I'm sure they hired some good car designer to come design their cars, but really it revolves around the technology, right? The technology is at the core of why um, that car just dominates the automotive industry right now. Um, and I think in similar ways, it's I think I'm sure you guys all know, like the example is that like Elon Musk said he needed to create the Roadster so that they could have the like sports car version and whatever, so that could create some money and hype and create some like trust in the industry, and then they would move towards kind of their ultimate goal, which is creating really affordable cars for like mass production type thing. So they started with the Roadster, and now
yeah,
they
they
ended
have
up with
this
like the Model
reverse
3.
approach.
And I think like a company like Icon is kind of smart in doing that, where they hire a firm like Big, um, with their ultimate goal being making affordable housing. Um, so I think it's similar in that way, and I think there's like other technologies that might employ similar strategies, which is like let's create things that can really convince people that this is a really amazing opportunity, and it's not just that it's sustainable, it's also like an amazing way to live or work or play or whatever that architecture is doing. So I think architects creating stronger alliances with technologies um, is going to be the future of not only sustainability but just I think building in general.
Yeah, I totally agree. Um, Hey guys, don't be shy. Do come up and share your views. This talk is recorded, but if you don't want to be on it, just let us know and we'll edit you out. But don't let that stop coming up and sharing your own views. But I think, yeah, Peter, I think you've really set the discussion off in an interesting way of like, what is the form that this change is going to be made in terms of like a practice. And um, I think the Tesla example is a great one. For those of you who are not familiar, that's as Peter kind of discussed. I think it was a very conscious thing by Elon Musk, right? That they started off, made it cool, made the technology interesting, just make a electric car that doesn't suck, and then come in with a high end one that's expensive, and people start to see famous people driving around in them, I guess, and then from there the technology became more and more accessible and scaled up, and so eventually they'll get to the Model 3 right now, which is affordable-ish. It's not super affordable, but I guess there's an affordable car coming, right? Um,
And I think like an opposite example that's actually in the building industry is something like rammed earth. And I think of course all over the world there are examples of rammed earth, but specifically in France and kind of like adjacent Switzerland, French part of Switzerland, there's a long history of rammed earth in rural areas, specifically for like farmers who are trying to store things, and um, I think it's a good example of how it was really like a lowbrow, kind of lower socioeconomic building technology. And so it never made its way, once industrialization happened, it never kind of found its own position in industrialization because it was always seen as kind of like a cheaper way to do it. And then, a firm like Herzog and Demiron comes and they build the Ricola. Um, I don't know if it's a factory or a storage facility in Switzerland, and they're kind of like Herzog being the ultimate like luxury and high end architecture, and then using this really what was perceived and kind of got left behind in industrialization, like pretty amazing building technology. Um, it kind of was the opposite, right? So like even though rammed earth has the potential to be a really amazing, sustainable, beautiful kind of structural building material, it's kind of been left behind. Um, so I guess it's another example of like the best idea doesn't win without a lot of other kind of factors and um, yeah, things going
Yeah, I
on with
think
it.
I've definitely heard some more about Round Earth, but what was the project you were saying? The Herzog de Meuron got into?
Yeah, they did a few projects for Ricola, the um, in Switzerland. So there's a rammed earth one. If you look it up, it's like this kind of beige rammed earth large building with a big circle window. But
Okay,
basically, they took this. When Herzog does something, it kind of finds its way into the um,
right.
discourse in a way. So you hope it'll continue to grow. And there are other examples of it and potentials going on, and you see things like it's not rammed earth, but then now there are these like kind of earth-based mixtures for 3D printing and all these sort of things. So I think it's about like also like a cultural stigma around certain
Interesting.
things.
I've not seen this project before, but it actually looks kind of interesting. If you'd seen it on the zine, you might almost like flick by it without if you didn't know it was made of rammed earth. It's very beautiful. It's like very simple in a way. But yeah, that's super interesting. I didn't know that. Interesting project.
Yeah, so that project it's a little um, I forget the author who spoke about it, but he was saying how it's a little misleading because it looks like it was almost rammed
Yeah,
on site, but it's actually a prefabricated blocks, like pretty
yeah.
large blocks.
I'm just looking
That
at the
and
construction
they
site.
they went in afterwards and yeah, they kind of went in afterwards and stitched it up a little bit, but yeah, I think it's just like a cool example of um, of taking something that's like outside of the kind of cultural acceptance and re-stigmatizing
Yeah.
it a bit.
I think for those of you who are not familiar, it's kind of like it's a very simple building. I'm looking at a construction shot of it, which is interesting because it's actually a precast concrete structure on the inside, not so super sustainable. But the rammed earth is almost like a cladding where they've rammed it somewhere else, but almost like a brick, and they're just it's like a giant brick wall made of rammed earth, and then they seem to fill the gaps in, so it looks like this monolithic thing. Super interesting. Thanks for bringing the project up. Ming, I seen you came up to the stage. How's it going?
Oh, hi, Holly. Hi,
What's up?
everyone else. Thanks for inviting me on stage. Very interesting talk so far, and you guys actually touch on some very, very interesting topics. From what's the future of architecture firms going to be? Are we going to be? Is it going to be one big firm? Growing bigger and bigger with speciality or in-house, or are we going to be small and nimble? Just a couple of things that just bring to the discussion and love to hear what do you think about that. I mean, in some way, when you talked about, are we just having, should architects just be having everything in house? And it just reminds me of in a way is like ACOM, isn't it? This kind of like big firm like ACOM or Arabs, they just try to do everything in house. They basically just say to the client, just give us the project, we'll solve all the problems for you. And somehow it's somehow it sort of works in a certain way, isn't it? And somehow it doesn't, isn't it? And because, as you say, that you can't always just have every single discipline in-house, and they don't necessarily always actually have the speciality. So I guess that's probably some of the issues that they're having, and hence that's why you sometimes you go the other way, that you being small and nimble and you just specialize on one thing. And I guess in terms of procuring building, that we probably all know that, as architects, that's sometimes and actually not up to us, isn't it? That we can say, well, hey, this is actually a M&E or structural engineers that you should appoint, and the client, or whatever reason, they say, no, that's you don't want to work it that way, or whatever. So it's kind of tricky, isn't it? That because it's such because procuring building is such a complex and long process. So is not quite as is somehow, this kind of efficiency of having the same team, all the time doesn't actually work. I don't know why. And then you bring in this kind of tech company, which I find it fascinating, and I just I couldn't actually seems to remember that even a couple of years ago, isn't it, that even now, isn't it, that a tech company actually tried to move into this space, that IBM and all the rest probably tried to actually say, well, we can do smart city. We just put sensors everywhere in the city, and then that somehow kind of fizzles out, isn't it? Because they don't quite really understand, I guess, what city is about, and it's quite complex. And putting sensor around, with the privacy issue, that people actually just get a bit nervous, about that. But then you get into this kind of space of, you mentioned something like Airbnb, but they're almost kind of like tech company actually come in. They're not producing anything, aren't they? They're just coming with a technological solution, and I'm wondering, whether they will really actually move into that kind of, as you say, as we all kind of find out, when you're actually producing a buildings, that is actually really difficult. And one last point, that I'm sort of thinking about this kind of 3D printing and massive efficiency and prefabricated. It just reminds me of we kind of had the technology of the MMC, the modern method of constructions, and because I'm actually based in the UK, it was quite hip, quite a few years ago, with House, HUF. House is a German company who just prefabricated all the panels, and you literally just go and specify everything, and they will actually cut everything within the factory, and they will ship it over. And as soon as you have a foundation, they will actually have the whole house actually finished for you within a week or something like that. And somehow that hasn't actually quite taken off, isn't it? And I don't know why. I think human being, we kind of like to change things and all that, and this kind of prefab, we for some reason we're not quite comfortable with it. Anyway, so that's some thought. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah.
That's just what I have.
Yeah, no,
Thanks.
super interesting. I think the final example of the House thing, that was super famous, wasn't it? I don't know what's happened to them, but I always find that with there's of course a stigma still with the word prefab. People think it's like a Lego looking house, or like one of those what am I trying to say, container homes kind of thing. So there's a bit of a stigma there, but the other problem is also, I found that, like, whenever I look at these companies, and there was like a whole rise of these what am I trying to say, like holiday homes, like huts in the woods and stuff like that. But the price tags that come with them were just ridiculous. They were just like, I could build a regular house, two regular houses for the price of like a little prefab huts. Like the VIP hut comes to mind, if any of you guys are familiar with that. I think it's called VIPP, maybe, if I remember correctly. But it's the tiny little prefabbed hut, beautiful, for like, to plonk in a forest or whatever. But it came in at a price tag of like 600 grand. So you could build a a mansion in the forest for that. So I think no one's ever. It's a hard one because there's obviously economies of scale for some of those things. So like I think on some cases the price tag at the same time um, is a killer. And also one of your points you were talking about it's just the act of the tech companies coming into the building world. It's just the act of making is so much more complicated than digital and silicon kind of companies. Well, as soon as you make things, it's incredibly energy intensive, mentally intensive, everything. And I think these tech companies, that's the part that's maybe a little bit misunderstood. And I think your point on like sensors harvesting data, I think is a really interesting point. But I know that was a big reason why this, or like a factor for why the um, Google slash Sidewalk Labs Toronto waterfront kind of development. People just thought it would be a Google City where Google are just watching and harvesting all your data and all that kind of stuff. So um, that was that was definitely a factor for why that kind of didn't work. Um, and your other point was like the ACOM example of it's not working too well. I think it's almost like no one has quite nailed the Tesla of the architecture or AEC world yet. And it almost seems like the problem is with these bigger, let's say, architecture firms that are kind of a one-stop shop. The problem is, I think, you you can do so many different types of projects, right? I think you almost need to like you focus in on a typology like housing or office or holiday homes or whatever, and then you specialize and create that kind of specialist team around that, so that you're not jumping from an airport one for the first half of the year and then a shopping mall for the second half of the year, and like the kind of knowledge doesn't transfer over. Um, but yeah, no, I think three super interesting points there.
Sorry, can I just jump one last thing? I guess you just come sort of dawn onto me. I guess one of the problems that the tech world or even kind of like let's say the Tesla or the Apple, they can't actually move into to the construction world is even for let's say a Tesla, right? It takes years to develop, but at the same time, you have this you have this cycle that you can entice people to upgrade. So Tesla can just go, this is actually a version one, and we will come up with a better one. So in 5 years' time, you can upgrade your car to a better version. It's the same as Apple with the iPhone or the latest laptop, right? So just come with the iPhone, and then 2 years later, you can upgrade to a better version. This kind of tech company kind of mentality. And I guess for building, you can't really do that, can you? A house or whatever is probably one of the biggest investment that you do in your life or for a company, right? You can't suddenly just go, well, we'll have a better version 5 years down the line. They kind of stuck. We kind of stuck, can't we? So I guess that's the huge issue. Probably talk too
No,
much.
not at all. I think maybe it's not so much that you need to keep upgrading or upsell, but the idea that you create one product and you can sell that thing multiple times. Whereas in real estate and architecture, you create a bespoke building, you create a bespoke solution, and then you sell that thing, you sell your services one time. So maybe it's more like jumping into the idea of a prefabricated building system or modular building system. You could create a product system that you can use multiple times after the fact. You're not just creating one system that creates one product. You're creating a system that can make many products. And then you could maybe argue that then the modular system could expand and contract, I guess, if we're talking about the typology of a single family home kind of thing. But I think it's more that I guess the AEC industry, we make bespoke products. We're what am I trying to say? The word I'm looking for is a prototype industry, right? We just create prototypes. We don't copy and paste them that often. But yeah, I know we. Oh, Peter, did you want to?
Well, just a couple of points. One was about the upgradability of technologies like cars or phones or whatever, and I actually don't think it's a selling point to an architectural technology because as long as whatever you're proposing um, is outperforming by leaps and bounds whatever else is out there, it's fine. It doesn't matter that a better one can come out in 5 years. At least you're, exponentially better than anything else out there at the present moment. If and that's under the condition that you, like Tesla, come out with a technology that's just in itself so, revolutionary that like, you know, if you have a generation one Tesla, sure, the one that comes out 5 years later is going to be much better, but at least you're still better than every other, kind of car out there. Um, and the other thing was about like this bespoke thing that it's not repeatable. We can't mass produce architecture. Um, I mean, we kind of do, right? But in a way that we don't all appreciate, where you get track homes, or you go in a gated community and there's three types of homes repeated 1,000 times, or something like that. But I think with technologies, you know, more like computer, computate excuse me, sorry, like computation technologies, you can actually create bespoke things and not have it be, um, totally out of budget. And kind of how we think of bespoke now being a luxury thing, I think it's going to become something that's um, much more accessible.
That's a great point. Yeah, we I guess no one's doing the copy and pasting well, or the repeating part well, because it literally is just copy and pasted in, like, the UK. We have like the Barrett Homes kind of situation where, or like, we've all seen those pictures of suburban towns where it's literally just the same house copied and pasted and rotated slightly differently. So yeah, maybe I should rephrase that and said no one's doing it. In-
Yeah, I mean, I think there's ones like, for example, Aravena in Chile after the earthquakes. I think is one of the reasons, one of his Pritzker projects, creating those homes where they were like half
oh,
homes, and they were all the same, but then the user kind of completed them in their own way, so everyone ended up looking quite
that's the
unique.
one where they had like
Um,
it was literally like half the house. It was a typical house profile, but only half the house was actually built, and then the rest was just an open roof. Is that, yeah?
exactly, yeah. So they set up the infrastructure for a full house. So I think probably a foundation and whatever type of plumbing had access to the empty part of the house, and then everyone kind of did something different. So some people filled it in to be a garage, some people made it an
Yeah.
outdoor space, some people made it an extra bedroom. Um, so it was actually pretty
Also
successful in that way.
a great reference you brought up there. I know we've also had. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong. Tapiwa. You raised your hand. So you've been on the stage for a little bit. Do you want anything you want to add, or jump into the conversation? Hey,
Yes, hi guys. Yeah, I think you did it correctly.
Tapiwa. Okay.
Tapiwa. I want to, yes, Tapiwa. I wanted to add something on what Peter was saying about on being sustainable when he talked about rammed earth. And then that's what I was thinking when I joined this conversation when you guys were talking about what things that we can use or the tech guys. And then I was thinking for us here in, like, I'm from Zimbabwe. We have this thing in our school, and I'm an architecture student. So there's these guys that came from Ibuki, and they were talking about rammed earth and how we can use rammed earth for sustainable buildings. And then right now, rammed earth, we still have them. They are used in our rural areas, but in the city centers and in urban areas, they are not used. And Peter said something about, oh, maybe it's cultural something. Like, as in, you might think culturally, you might think, oh, this is backward if I use rammed earth. But then the Ibuki guys was actually educating us on, no, you can use it. You can make earth bricks, and then you can also be saving. It's an environmental friendly thing, right? In that less carbon dioxide emissions and whatnot. And then our our lecturers went to talk with the local councils to sort of say maybe editing bylaws to adjust, edit them to allow earth bricks. And then they were like, no, we cannot allow that. So I was thinking also again during the conversation when you're saying who is going to be responsible in changing things, and I was thinking maybe it's individual architects with their firms, in that you can be an architectural firm and then you can start pushing on earth building and start saying, no, let's use earth bricks. They can work. We can do them in such a way that they can look modern. Maybe people don't want to use them because in the rural areas they are used in a way where they plaster them with planks and our round huts, and people maybe might think we can't use them. But I think as architects coming through, we could be the ones to shape or change people's ideas. So maybe it depends on where you are in the world, I guess, on who will shape the future to have sustainable buildings or structures.
Yeah, I think that's a point you brought up is like the idea of putting ideas out there is a great way to you don't have to create get into just making buildings, I guess, because that's kind of what we've just been talking about, is like maybe how architects can go into actually making buildings and start churning out thousands of homes. But there is also like exactly like you said, like putting ideas out there that influence other people to create more sustainable ways of building. And I think the rammed earth thing is a great example. It kind of feels a little bit similar to mass timber in a way, where it's like it's an old technology or an old method that's now being reinvented by a little bit of modern technology, and just kind of reviving the idea and putting it out there. I think you can have a huge impact, and that's super interesting as well. Where you also get like different areas or different regions of the world have that local knowledge of sustainable building methods. And I think, for example, if you were to do an idea or a competition that you just put out there, this idea of building with rammed earth, and someone else sees it and someone else sees it, you kind of have seen that with the mass timber front, and you are seeing it a little bit now. Like I'm hearing more about rammed earth recently, and I'm definitely going to be looking into it a bit more. But putting ideas out there, that's another really great way for architects to just play a role in a more sustainable future. Especially when they have this kind of local knowledge as well. I think that's super interesting. And also the digital world we live in now, before that would have been really difficult to, you'd have to get published in a newspaper or some other like article, or, whatever the latest magazine is. Whereas now you can kind of put your idea out there on Instagram and these kind of online pages and all that kind of stuff, and your idea can go very far.
Yeah, and I also wanted to say something about once I don't know who it was that was talking about what would be best to have engineers and architects working in one space, or for them collaborating as in maybe an architecture firm and an engineering kind or something. And I was also thinking in this side that we have architecture firms, and then architecture firms can work with maybe engineering firms or a construction company. And usually, a construction company doesn't have an architect; they just have the other contractors and quantity surveyors and whatnot. And then those people will team up with architecture firms. And I think it's best for them to be separated, maybe for you to have more freedom of expression in your architecture firm. It will give you more space to design. Whereas I don't know, I think if an engineer is present in your firm, it might restrict how you do things, unless in your design. I don't know. That's what I think.
Yeah, of course, there's that balance between, you don't want to over constrain yourself too early on, for example, if designing, but then you also don't want it to be completely uh, out there, like anything can go. So I think you need that balance. And that's a large part of hiring people that are on the right page, right? I guess you want to find someone like a Guillaume who has both sides of the coin, like the engineer and architect, and the design and the you know more pragmatic engineering side as well. So I think it's about finding the right people.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really hard for engineers to start from a blank page. That's the superpower of architects, is that they come up with an idea and then it's the beginning of the conversation. I don't think there's many engineers that would be like, okay, that's a site, make a structure that's efficient. And the question is like, well, a structure for what? Like, what are the spaces we're trying to make? So it's not like they're gonna tell you, it needs to be a box of like 10 by 10 by 10 or whatever. um, it's always kind of conversation. And as you say, Oliver, it's like about finding the person who is willing to, you know, um, question what you're trying to do, but bring their knowledge along to make it better, not necessarily impose their kind of strict rules, because I don't think there are strict rules
Yeah,
really.
exactly. Yeah, I know. I've worked with a bunch of engineers on some of my projects, and yeah, it's if you click well, I think it's a really interesting perspective to have at that early stage. Um, Randy, I see you in the crowd. Good to see you again. Do you want to jump in and add anything to the conversation?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, cool. Hi. Yeah, it's good to see you guys again. Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Um, and I think also partly the reason why is because uh, I've been having exactly the same thoughts as a lot of the things that have just been discussed. Um, I think I'm sort of like at the point in my career, I suppose, where I'm trying to think ahead, trying to be ahead of the curve, and kind of thinking of what role I want to carve, for myself um, as an architect within the AEC industry. And I think as someone who feels quite frustrated with traditional architecture practice, a lot of what's been discussed today are the kind of same exact thoughts I've been having as well. I think it's really interesting that I think it was you only that brought up the fact that no one has quite managed to kind of come up with the Tesla of the AEC space, and I think that's very interesting because if we're talking about kind of huge tech companies like um, Tesla, Google, Apple, um, who these are companies that have obviously massively changed the way that we live, the way that we perceive, um, social connection, sustainability, technology, and I think one kind of common denominator with all of these tech companies is that there always seems to be a bigger vision behind it, and it's not just kind of design a product, manufacture it, and sell it, but there always seems to be a much kind of bigger vision behind it. And I think the question that I'm kind of asking myself is, what is the bigger vision that architects could be addressing? Um, I think as architects, introspectively, we know the issues and challenges that society faces that perhaps we could find a role in addressing, such as climate change, sustainability, um, the kind of shortage in housing, things like that. Um, but I think there is the kind of way for me personally, I think, to think about it is to try and understand, what is kind of the the bigger vision. I really like the idea of the archipreneur, right? Who is kind of an architect, but also thinks as an entrepreneur, and is kind of in a position to innovate and perhaps start a space, prop tech space. These are all very exciting things that are happening, and perhaps I don't think the architects are paying enough attention to all of that stuff. Um, but I think as if that's perhaps the route that we want to go down, or if perhaps maybe that's the right answer. First of all, as you guys already said, you need to narrow it down. So, for example, if let's say I wanted to create a startup and um, just focus on homes, for example, right? I think that okay, it's all kind of fine to kind of think about how the prefabricated elements come in, to think about how computational design, generative design, all of that stuff comes in to obviously make the design process more efficient. But I think ultimately there would need to kind of be a much bigger kind of ambition behind it rather than just making the process of designing a home or designing the home more efficient. And I think that's where we have to kind of look around us, kind of step out and think outside of the box. Not necessarily even think outside of the box, but kind of just think outside the AEC space. And, when it comes to homes, for example, I think one of the biggest challenges that, current kind of generation, Z and millennials are facing is that it's really difficult to get on the property ladder, right? And I think that's an issue that's affecting a whole kind of generation of people, possibly even more than my generation of people. And so, as an architect, you could that could perhaps be an opportunity to think, okay, how do I employ my knowledge and skills as an entrepreneur? How do I also employ perhaps tech and maybe and then I think at that point the kind of bigger vision becomes actually how do we make uh, buying a house more accessible and affordable for a generation. And I think that in that in that sense, that kind of thinking elevates, your ambition as an architect, and it gives you a purpose that's bigger than just architectural design, but that's actually more about true problem solving, um, and also of kind of innovation on a much bigger scale, and kind of thinking um, that can be applied, for kind of much wider and bigger issues, um, or homelessness, for example, right? Um, so I think uh, that's kind of like for me, I think, and that's what brings all of this thinking together, um, and that's what I think, kind of gives all of this kind of true purpose. Um, because I kind of yeah I kind of feel like architects in the way that we work currently is we're too obviously kind of closed off in our own bubbles, and we just think about the current project, the current client, and once the project's handed over, we move on to the next. And I think we're honestly missing out on so many opportunities to to really prove our worth, as architects to wider society, not just our clients. Um, and I think this idea of moving away from thinking about architecture kind of as a service, but started to think about it as a product. Um, I think it's really exciting, and I'm definitely really excited about the kind of prospects of operating in prop tech and creating a startup that has a much kind of bigger vision and ambition than just making a
Yeah,
developer some money.
totally agree. Yeah, no, I think that's the idea that springs to mind, isn't it? It's also, for me, I guess the why is still is kind of the title of this talk. The how how can we play a role in a sustainable future? Very much like how it's the underlying why of Tesla and SpaceX, I guess, is that it's the same why, and then you can have many different avenues within that. Let's say, like you said, a focus on sustainable housing, sustainable affordable housing. You can focus on building sustainable offices or whatever that typology or thing. It could be as simple as creating a tool to analyze embodied carbon that's a plug into Rhino or Revit or something like that. I guess it doesn't have to be a big building making idea. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that's what excites me, and that's what has definitely been on my mind as an architect. Like, uh, creating something a bit more specific that has that big impact. But I think the why, I guess, is still there, and I guess you could still, you could still create an architecture practice um, under that idea. I think there was an interview where Bianca was talking about how, even if Big continues to be super successful in his lifetime, I think, what he may create 200 buildings at let's say at the best in his lifetime, um, which is great. But when you look at it, that's still a micro fraction of how many buildings are going to get built over the next, um, 30, 40, 50 years or whatever that time frame is. So you either go down that route of creating many, many buildings, or you also create ideas that affect or influence other people to create ideas. And so I think maybe the conclusion of the talk so far is there that is still valid. You could go down the startup route to actually create and build buildings and actually get into the act of making. Or you could also be a little bit of like what I'm doing with Pixel is just putting ideas out there that you think will positively influence people, and exactly like the rammed earth idea, putting ideas that influence other people to start thinking about that in their own practice and their own building stuff. So um, yeah, love the thinking, Randy, and yeah, we should all just club together and start making a affordable housing startup here. That would be the best way. uh,
I'm down
yeah,
for that.
we'll put that on. I see we have one more person that raised their hand. Ahmad. I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, but do you want to jump in and add anything to the conversation? Or oh, hey,
Yes, I
hey.
want to. Hi, Ollie, William, and Ming, everyone. Yeah, interesting conversation here. And I just want to ask a simple thing for me that's really the debate with sustainability in terms of longevity of life of a material compared to the short-term level of carbon embodied energy it takes. And I'd like to maybe refer to the Ricola project mentioned earlier. And it's just I'm curious, where the source of that rammed earth is and how it got to that site. As you said, it was rammed somewhere else and just shipped onto the site. So one would wonder, the whole embodied energy of that, and in the long term, how many years does it take that material to require maintenance? So it's things like this for me that start to question as architects. We we should learn to strike the balance with materials. It's not always that the material is sustainable in one direction. Is it holistically sustainable? And I think that that's a crucial part of things we haven't dealt with. And I'll be interested in hearing your own views to that subject, because for me, if you're having to ship a sustainable material all the way from another country or continent entirely, and there's quite a lot going on about it, how many years down the life of that material in your house does it pay to offset the carbon emissions responsible for bringing it to that site? Also, is it a material that is now suitable for your own climate? Because you would assume that someone has brought a material somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that it is local to his context, and it might not produce the best results. I mean, although we're thankful today for technologies that allow us to predict the performance of these materials, but does how accurate are these predictions, and are we really being honest and practical with these things? So I'm interested in understanding your views about like the transposition of context of materials and technology to other places and how sustainable that is, especially the processes involved in that transposition and movement.
Yeah, I think it's about just being honest, isn't it? And like looking at things intelligently, And in that particular project, I assume the whole point of the round earth is that they can literally maybe even get it from the site. So yeah, that comes with an assumed sustainability factor to it, that they've actually sourced it from a local or even the site. But I think it's maybe taking that kind of I know I'm not no physics expert, but like a physics mentality is to try and prove yourself wrong. So like if you think this is a sustainable material, spend some time trying to prove yourself wrong in order to verify that the thing is actually sustainable, right? Like an example that you're talking about with the round earth, for example, mass timber. The idea is that like because the wood actually absorbs CO2, even including the process of manufacturing and transportation, it's actually absorbed more CO2 than has emitted in that process. So, but you're right. I think you know, I think we will see more and more kind of embodied carbon calculators coming on. I know individual firms are working on them in-house, but as I said before, like maybe something where it's a plug into Rhino and Revit or whatever tool you use where you can calculate those things. But I think it's a bit of both. Like the tools, I guess, will get more accurate to calculate this kind of stuff. But then we also have to be honest as architects that you've got to self reflect and self analyze your solutions to confirm that they are really sustainable or whatever it is you might think. Which is, I guess, just a mentality and education and that kind of stuff. But I feel, I guess I'm more optimistic that I think architects do think about that and do question that. That's what makes architects, special in a way. We're no strangers to criticism and trying to kind of critically evaluate your own ideas and decisions and that kind of thing. So maybe
Yeah, I think your point, Ahmad, is like you need to open your knowledge to as far as you can, basically, and try to understand as much as possible of the whole system you work in. Even if you work at a building scale, you basically need to understand how the whole global economy works in a way. And I think right now when we talk about transportation, local resourcing makes a lot of sense because transportation is a huge part of the embodied carbon of materials. But that may change, like as transportation becomes cleaner. I was listening to this podcast talking about companies developing boats, like container ships that are going to work on electricity sources or hydrogen or new technologies to allow them to, travel long distances without too much impact. Of course, I mean, it's always like, where's the battery coming from? Like it's a constant, it's a rabbit hole of like going way deep in the layers. Um, but I think you're right, and it's about questioning and understanding the whole process, and as far as you can, basically.
Y- Yeah, I think that your last line kind of sums it up, Guillaume. Because for me, it's not it's a whole system. It should be cyclic, like we like to say in the sustainable terms. It should be the whole cycle of the material. And sometimes, I mean, honestly, as architects, sometimes we're not that candid with the realities of these things.
Yeah, well said. I think we'll go to Eva for maybe the last question before we wrap it up. Eva, welcome back. How's it going? Hey, Eva, I don't know if you're on mute or you want to add something to the conversation. Oh, she's gone. We lost her. But no, I think that's it's a great point that having to be a bit more self-reflective and honest as architects. Um, that classic approach of maybe designing something and then I guess the term is greenwashing, isn't it? Of like once you're done, you slap a few solar panels on the roof and wham bam, you've got a sustainable building. But in reality, it's not quite like that. Eva, you're back.
Hey guys, sorry, I was having trouble
No worries.
accessing the mic. Love the conversation today. You actually raised a question that has been troubling me this entire year. I'm finishing my part two, and we were very focused on sustainability. And I love the point that the previous speaker actually raised about just using technologies without using the environment in, like, what I'm trying to say. We are architects. We have an incredible mind. We use technology. We use new materials. We research. We never stop researching. But one thing we don't do is use nature. We don't design with nature because we are so cocky with technologies and new materials that sometimes we forget that the solutions for sustainability is just looking outside of our window and using what nature is giving us. So I love all the points you guys actually did, and that's what makes architects different than any other speciality. We can actually do so many things. Don't you guys agree? And use nature, use technologies, talk with engineers, talk with electricians, M&E, sorry.
Yeah,
It's
I totally agree.
amazing.
I think I guess what you're touching on a little bit there is some people, biomimicry. I guess that's sort of the term. Well, maybe not actually, but like for example, I think that's one reason why I really gravitate towards mass timber, where it's kind of like a sustainable building material, but it also the nature side of it comes with a lot of benefits of biophilia and creating a really healthy environment to live in because you're immersed in natural materials, natural woods and things like that, because you can leave the structure bare, for example. But yeah, I think there's also that I don't know if, yeah, biomimicry is maybe not the right term, but I guess there's parts of biomimicry is right because you get sometimes as architects, architects use biomimicry to create a fun-looking building, but it's not necessarily performing in the same way. You can shape a building like a lily pad, for example, but it's not because the building is collecting rainwater or something, or like, I think you get what I mean. Um, but yeah, I've been really interested in that recently. I have a friend who just did a like course in horticulture as well, and I was like learning a lot from her and how that works, and all these different kind of what was it? How would you call it? Maybe earth technologies, like the rammed earth thing, the mass timber, and all these other kind of stuff. I know there's some way more experimental stuff out there, but yeah, I think getting back to Mother Nature a little bit in architecture is for sure. But yeah, I'm really interested in biophilia. I know that's kind of a new thing right now. Not new, sorry, but it's like a new trend right now is biophilia and in design. But yeah, no, I think especially having lived in cities for so long, I really, really, and having grown up in the countryside, I crave nature a lot more, and I think it's definitely kind of playing its part in my own kind of design work and my own design philosophy. But yeah, I totally agree. Like reinventing, I don't, yeah, earth technology. I don't know quite the word I'm looking for, but yeah, using technology to bring some of these very analog, sustainable methods to modern methods of construction, I guess. Um, I think it's been a super interesting conversation. I think we'll maybe wrap it up there. We've been for like an hour and 40. I don't know, Guillaume, if you're still there. I know he has to shoot off, but I think this has been a super interesting chat. It kind of touched on our last talk. If any of you guys missed that, we will be putting it on our YouTube channel soon, where we were talking about rethinking the business model of architecture. And actually, this talk kind of went full circle and touched back on some of those topics, which kind of indicates that it's something that we should start doing as architects, I guess. But otherwise, thanks everyone for joining. Guillaume, I don't know if you're there, if you have any sign off that you want to put out there, any conclusions, but thank you for everyone for coming to the stage and sharing your opinion. And yeah.
Ollie.
Yeah, tune in next week. We'll have another talk this time next Sunday. I'm thinking we should do something on the topic of space because we've been meaning to do it for a while. We've obviously just had the projects in the office on our 3D printing habitat on Mars. So yeah, maybe we'll do something on space next time, or I'm thinking a eco-parametric architect that I have in mind. So stay tuned. We'll post it on our Instagram page. You can follow it through my Instagram. Otherwise, have a great Sunday, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you, guys.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.